So, Jow, somebody hands you a Jack in the Box, right? You know, the little box, got a little handle. You turn the handle, plays a song. At some point, while the song plays, exactly. At some point, something's going to pop out of that box. You're assuming it might be a clown. It might not be. It could be a stuffed teddy bear. It could be a chicken. Who knows, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't know until the box opens. So, in a lot of ways, stories can exist like a Jack in the Box in the sense that somebody hands you a story. All stories have a certain kind of format where you know how it's going to initially work, right? You're introduced to a main character, some supporting cast of characters. You have some sort of rising action. You know that something's going to happen to your main character where they need to accomplish a goal, or they have something that they want to do, or something's happening that they need to fix their situation. And at some point in the story, this main character is going to deal with difficulties in accomplishing that goal, and they will either succeed or they will fail in that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is the setup that everybody kind of comes into when they come into a story. This is all the expectations that they have initially. So the other part of that, right, is the payoff. And that is, given all that is set up, the payoff is what you get from that story that you weren't expecting. And a lot of that is based on what you were expecting being mutated into the new thing. Is my analogy useful in terms of talking about a story and talking about, how we describe writing a story?
Yes. I would definitely say that's applicable since when we go into a story, I mean, granted, I'm kind of shooting myself in the foot here because there are plenty of examples of people revisiting stories, which we'll talk to a little bit more as we go on to this podcast about this idea of setups and payoffs. But when you go into a story fresh, it's almost like the concept of spoilers. Uh,
Yeah.
there's a large portion of, I don't know what the audience, I guess we'll just call them the audience, that does not want to know spoilers, and rightfully so, because I think when you go into a story fresh for the first time ever, you
Yeah.
want to experience everything that happens as opposed to having the forethought of knowing what's coming and this and that, because how you react to something as it unfolds is much more interesting, it's more lively, um, it's more entertaining, it's more impactful, all of that stuff. It's literally what transports us to another world, the world that the artist has created.
Right.
So we're talking about like the idea of the setup is kind of getting you ready for that, and then the payoff is, like you said, mutating it into some unexpected way that the audience wasn't seeing coming, and that's where excitement lives. That's where mystery dies. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and that's life because you never, I don't know, I assume I'm going to wake up every day and go to work and come home and eat dinner and go to sleep,
Yeah.
but little did I know one day that I would wake up and I would be locked in my house for over a year, like
Right. Exactly.
no one saw that shit coming. So uh yeah, no, that's absolutely a great way to describe setups and payoffs, and I think that's kind of the purpose. Would you agree that that's where the energy of a story lives, is in that mutation, that unexpected
Oh yeah,
payoff?
for sure. I mean, because if you knew, a lot of people listen to songs knowing exactly how the song goes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they first got into that song initially because they did not know how that song was going to go. There were several aspects or elements to the song that, you'll have your rhythm, you'll have your melody, and there'll be, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, a bridge, one more round of chorus, and then the song's over. You know, when you describe it in that abstract way, it sounds really fucking boring, right? Because it's just that's the mathematics of constructing.
That's the structure. Yeah. Right.
The structure is always boring because it has to be, because it needs to be stable. In order for a good story to exist, it needs to have a stable structure, some kind of backbone that is oftentimes, I mean, you know, like the hero's journey type story structure, it's millennia old. That's why so many people like to use it, because it's tried and true. You know it's going to work in the sense of you're going to get your return on investment most of the time, basically.
Yeah.
It's that idea, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But what were you going to say, Jow?
Well, I was going to say, and this is something that a lot of people get confused with. Like, a lot of people, I don't want to call myself a mentor, but a lot of people in some of the writing circles that I swim look at me as kind of the guy to go to when it comes to structure. And there are a lot of, I don't know what the word is, bullheads, I guess you could say, which traditionally like to buck structure because they feel like it's flat and boring. And I want to clarify for our audience that structure and setups and payoffs are two entirely different things. A structure is like a narrative, kind of fill in the blank, and the word that people like to use is formulaic. But the setups and payoffs live within it. Those are kind of the ratio. It wouldn't be me if I didn't make a food reference, but it's the ingredients. It's the ingredients when you're, you know, putting together the recipe of your story. So, like, a lot of people will say, "Oh, you got to make a cupcake." Well, the structure would be the muffin pan. Like, everybody puts their batter into the muffin pan. That is the structure. That's the formula. I mean, it's not a cupcake if it doesn't have that structure, literally a physical structure. But the setups and payoffs are, if I put like a cherry on top and then I put like a brown cake into it, you're going to assume, oh, that's a chocolate cupcake with a cherry top. But if I used, I don't know, like a mocha or a caramel, and I put like brown food dye in it, that's like throwing you for a loop because you automatically assumed, oh, there's cherry and a dark color, that's chocolate cupcake. No, it's a caramel cupcake or a mocha cupcake or whatever it may be. That's where you as an artist are allowed to play. So I just wanted to clarify that. There is a very
useful clarification. So I think going further into this analogy, and let's see if I can do this. So let's pick a particular genre of story, right? For instance, horror, right? Horror has a certain structure. So you want to set up a horror story, or you want to set up a particular thing happening in the story, right? So you have a house, right? And it's old, dusty, and our protagonists come into it on a dark and stormy night. This is all very
classic
setups, right?
Yep.
So now we get into the payoff part, because now you have all these expectations about, well, something spooky is going to happen. That's where you can mess around with the format. You can take a left turn. You can say, oh, actually, it would turn out to be a fine night that night. And then the murder happens on a sunny afternoon the next day.
Yep.
And that's when you go ahead, Jow.
That's subverting expectations. That's what you're supposed to do when you're constructing a story, is because you're supposed to be aware, you're supposed to be tapped into your audience's knowledge. So that's one of my favorite horror movies of all time, Scream, tapped into this. Everybody knows the scene from Scream where Randy, Jamie Kennedy, lays out the rules. You know, don't say I'll be right back, because you won't be back. Don't have sex. Don't, like, all of these rules were kind of solidified in the 80s of, if you do this, you will die. So when you went to a horror movie, you saw, oh, there's the big blonde with the big boobs and she's having sex with the guy. She's dead. Like, it was, you know, and everybody, and then it happened. And
Yeah.
it took away from the horror aspect of it, and that's when horror started becoming a little bit more campy and comedic by nature, and people took it less seriously, which, yeah, that subverts the nature of it, but that's not the genre. The genre means stick to what I'm here for. This is what I paid my 850 for. I want to be scared.
Yeah.
I don't want to go in there and just laugh.
Right.
So when Scream came along and said, "Hey, guess what? We know all the rules and the cliches and tropes that you know, and now we're not going to do them." And then they ended up doing some of them and doing and not doing other ones. So they made like a mixed bag of it, and no one knew what to expect, and that's what put people on the edge of their seats, and that's why that movie and that franchise was a big hit for so long.
Yeah.
I don't know why I got into this.
No, because we were talking about the format of setups and payoffs in horror, and I had
Oh,
started off with using horror as an example as the place where
well,
you
because
can mess
horror,
around with.
yeah, horror is absolutely about setups and payoffs. 100%. Horror and comedy are like the two biggest
Yeah.
genres that lean on this particular writing technique, mostly because that emotion comes out of the unexpected. Like everybody's seen what they call the jump scare, where it's like, all of a sudden, really quick, somebody jumps out at you, whatever. You weren't expecting it, and that's why it happens.
Yeah.
Same thing with comedy. Somebody makes an off comment about something, and then it pays off later. And it's not startling, which is why it's not considered scary, but you put the pieces together slower in your mind, and that's why it's funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, they're essential to those particular genres. Um, so I think it might be probably a good idea for us right now to just we've kind of talked about the purpose and all that kind of stuff, but I think we should maybe cite a couple of our favorite examples of
Oh
setups and
yeah.
payoffs,
Uh,
just for reference to to our audience, so they can maybe grasp the concept a little bit better. I'll lead because it looks like you're thinking of
please.
one.
Yeah, I'm thinking hard because it's gonna take me a second.
I probably should have prepped you on that, but
That's all right.
have you ever seen a movie? And I hope you have, because if you haven't, I'm going to beg you to do it before the next time we have a podcast. Have you ever seen Return of the Killer Tomatoes, starring
It's
George
been a
Clooney?
while. It's been a while, but we watched that movie together because
Yes,
you want to show it to me. I enjoyed it a
that's
lot.
that's right. I did discover this movie in college, and I did make you watch it. Do you remember? In the middle of the movie, George Clooney works at a pizza parlor, and
Yeah.
I forget what's happening. The movie's ridiculous, by the way. If you haven't seen Return of the Killer Tomatoes, you need to. It's a masterclass in comedic setups and payoffs. Um, there's a moment when George Clooney or the other guy, I forget what his name is, they throw the dough up in the air like when they do when they're making pizza pie, and something else happens, and like the dough never comes down, and nothing, like it just gets forgotten, and it's almost like if you were watching it now, you would automatically assume it was a B movie. Oh, plot hole. Look, they forgot about catching the pizza. Da 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 da.
Yeah.
In the spoiler alert, the last 5 minutes of the movie, when like everything has ended or whatever, like they're in a completely different location. It's been like hours later. All of a sudden,
Yeah,
the
I remember
dough
that.
falls right on top of George Clooney, and it's just like the best payoff ever.
Yeah.
Um, that
I
was
was just
definitely. Go ahead.
No, that was a good one. I was just thinking one that's a little bit more abstract and a little bit more it's more story, it's more like a story arc setup and payoff. So Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, all right? You have
Yes.
the scene where Charlie and his grandpa, they're floating up, right? And they take him the fizzy Lipton drink or whatever it's called. I can't quite remember. But,
Yeah.
they're going to get chopped up by the blades. They burp, they fall down, right?
Right.
That is actually, it's really interesting because I never really thought about that. But it's actually a setup for later, like the end of the movie when they break out of the glass ceiling. And what that is it's a setup for initially you're like, how are they going? Initially, it's an emotional setup. All right.
Okay.
Because originally they are flying, they're floating, and it's dangerous. Does that make sense
Yeah.
what I'm saying? All right,
Yep.
so follow me. Next, they get into the elevator and they're flying, and it's now liberating. So it's a payoff in the sense of now you're seeing them doing the same thing, but now it's in a way that is in a positive light instead of a negative light. So that to me is like another way of doing a setup and a payoff where
I love that.
it's not directly obvious, right?
Yes.
Directly obvious ones are great. Like your example about the pizza dough, it's a great joke. It's a
Yeah.
great setup for a joke. This one is more like it's a way of thinking about setting up and paying off in a way that is thematic, basically, because it all goes into the kind of the themes in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where it's like success for Charlie is something that's never available. It's not something that's possible, and then suddenly these events take place where it does become possible after several different kind of trials, essentially, or one major trial, really.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and now that you mention it, I'm starting to see that it's a little bit more integral to other genres in different ways than I had originally thought of. While you were talking about that, for some reason, I started thinking about sentimentality because you were talking about it being thematic payoff and stuff like that, and I started realizing that my wife watches a lot of those Hallmark Christmas movies and this and that, but a lot of that cheesy romantic stuff that ends up happening is always the result of a setup and a payoff. It's very on the nose
Uh,
and obvious, but you
yeah,
know something? That's the stuff that my wife and other people who enjoy that particular sappy love romantic drama, that's what they go for. It's like, oh, the pen that she lost is the one that he wrote that letter with, and that's so special. You know what I mean? Like that ends
that is
up.
definitely the heart of like a romantic, like what's the word, romantic story, right? Because
Yeah.
you want, like you're saying, it's integral. You want everything to sort of come back to the beginning of their first meeting, the first time they met.
Or something that happened disastrous
Yeah.
in their particular, you know what I mean? Because it's always, oh, the guy and the girl hate each other and this is why and da 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 da. And it's always something that's tied to that. Like
No, I
he
get what you
values
mean
his
with the
job
sentimentality.
more or something like that, and
Yeah.
then he quits because that's why he loves her or whatever. But now I'm starting to think that it is integral to almost probably every single genre. There is an expectation for it to be in genre. And I remember the last time you and I talked about this particular subject, you brought up the most recent Tarantino movie. And
Yes,
that's kind of
I
a
forgot.
drama
Yes,
action movie. I know you forgot. That's why I
let's
wanted to
go
bring it back
over
up.
that.
But go into it, sir, because this was
Yeah,
totally you.
so Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, one of my most recent favorite movies, has this great setup and payoff where at the beginning of kind of at the beginning of the movie when you learn about like all the movies that Rick Dalton has been in, when you learn about his career, one of the movies he does is this World War II movie. He plays like a soldier in World War II. It's kind of a callback to Inglourious Bastards. I'm sure it's some reference to some World War II movie that Quentin Tarantino was into as a child.
Sure.
But in that movie, like in the movie within the movie,
Right.
uh, uh,
It's so hard
Leonardo
with
DiCaprio's
Tarantino.
Leonardo DiCaprio's character uses a flamethrower to like fry Nazis. And you don't think anything of it because
It's
there's all
just a
this
cool
story that
moment. Yeah.
yes, there's all this story that takes place, between this and the end of the movie. And you're not really sure how everything's going to land. Everything is sort of setting up, but you don't realize it's setting up at all. Like you don't
No.
realize that you like go to the Manson family ranch. You don't know why. Like it's just kind of a thing that happens. A lot of stuff happening in that story where it's like it just seems like things are happening, but then the last act of the movie, everything comes together, right? Like
Everything. Literally everything that happened. All the mundane nothing moments
yeah,
that you've been
like
like, why is
Brad
this?
Pitt buys like an LSD laced cigarette at the beginning. You don't think that's going to go anywhere. Well, he ends up smoking it, and you learn about the relationship between him and his dog, and you think this is just like a nice scene.
Yeah.
Actually, this is set up for this major event that happens in the last act, and so the flamethrower comes back in like one of the most surprising, shocking, like holy shit scenes that I'm sure a lot of people have already seen it, but if you haven't seen it, watch Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It is like one of my favorite examples of a setup and a payoff where it's just like you do not see it coming at all. And when it all connects, it's like one of the best. It's one of the best payoffs I've seen in a movie in a long time.
That's something that I had written down in terms of us tackling it was inserting seemingly useless exposition into a film. Like the setups, if they're done correctly, are usually very subtle. And what Tarantino did in that particular instance was he made you think you were watching one type of movie. There's like I want to call it a budding genre these days, but it's like a slice of life movie where
Yeah.
not much happens in terms of the actual plot or even the character development. It's just 2 hours of this is what this person's life is like. I particularly am not a fan of that genre. I like a little bit more conflict and, some kind of an arc to go on. I'm a classical guy like that. But when I was watching this, I thought it was just Tarantino writing a love letter to his favorite decade of film production and a swan song and a tip of the hat to the actors of that heyday and this and that. And I thought, okay, it's just a bunch of interesting scenes with Tarantino, staring at, finding ways to
Yeah.
take his actresses' shoes off and this and that. But
Yeah.
in actuality, what he had done was very subtly, and I mean subtly, put in
Yeah.
like a whole ton of pay or setups that paid off, and it makes it so that one sequence at the end of the film is masterful. Like I don't know, I can see so many audience members going and watching that movie going, this is so boring. When's something gonna happen? Da 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 da. And then that scene happens, and whether or not you're familiar with the Manson family murders, or you're going to remember that scene forever.
Yeah.
Not because it's different. It's not because it's alternative history. It's because he so masterfully layered in those setups and paid them off all at once. And that was what caught everyone by surprise. So if you were familiar with the whole Sharon Tate thing, you kind of expected Tarantino was going to go another way after Inglourious Bastards with his whole revisionist
Right.
history thing, whatever. It was kind of like a gimmick that had been assigned to him all of a sudden. But then, if you weren't familiar with the whole Sharon Tate thing and the Manson stuff, it didn't matter because that moment was, from a storyteller standpoint, that was so masterfully done that the
Yeah.
craft is what jumped out at the audience member. So it almost made it universally appealing to any audience member that went and saw it. It totally removed the necessary context of what he was doing, or what had actually happened, I should say,
Yeah.
to being dependent of whether or not the audience member enjoyed the film, which I love. That is what actual artist does. So when everyone who like kind of rags on Tarantino, oh, he just copies and this and that. Yeah, he does. He does play a lot of homage. He does. But in order to do that, he needs to masterfully understand how to structure and do the craft and execute techniques and stuff. And he put it on full display. And I love that about that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
so we were talking about that. Now, I did touch upon this a little bit in what I was just talking about. I'm curious to know your opinion on this, Mr. Rainwater. In a culture of today where everyone has a phone or there's a computer nearby or a tablet or whatever, and especially in the last year where we're watching everything on TV at home where there's a million different distractions, is there merit for an artist to embed subtle setups into their storytelling? Because there's a very good chance it's going to go overlooked and underappreciated or not even appreciated at all. Do you think it's worth the
I
time and effort on the part of the artist to put that into their work? Because it is a lot of time
I
and effort forethought.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot of time and effort for the artist to have to like think up how all those things are going to connect within the overall integrity of the story and whatnot. But here's the thing. This was something that was just kind of occurring to me as an analogy. I mean, it's just another art form, right? Video games often have a lot of Easter eggs, a lot of hidden areas, stuff like that, that
Yep.
will totally go unappreciated by the casual player. And the same goes for, I feel like, any art form where if you listen to a song, say, I mean, I listen to David Bowie songs pretty regularly. You know, like I listen to his whole discography over and over again because he's just one of those
Nothing
artists
wrong
who
with
I
that.
appreciate.
Sure.
And you, something I appreciate about his work is it's designed to be listened to over and over again because there are all sorts of little subtle audio subtleties that he has between choruses, things like just little bits of instruments that show up that I didn't notice the last time, things like that, right? So in a story, I personally do this a lot in Trailer Park Warlock. Like I like to have little Easter eggs for readers, and it's also fun for me to see people who notice them in the comments section. And so I do a lot of stories where I will set up stuff in that way. Like I've done it between seasons where I've set up I end up setting up storylines kind of by accident, really honestly. But it's just like as a storyteller, I'm like, okay, well, where do I want to go next? And I'll look back at what I've done previously and say, okay, this is a great area that I can focus in on to go forward. So, for example, season 1 of Trailer Park Warlock, I designed a choker to go around my main character Jake Baker's neck. I didn't have a reason. It was just I thought it looked interesting. It looked like kind of like a
It was an
yeah.
aesthetically pleasing thing that you just, felt as an artist to put in there.
The one thing that made him look more warlock-ish, because otherwise kind of looked like just like a redneck working class guy, which is fine. It's part of what I wanted, but I also want a little touch of something that made him look outside of the normal. And so at the end of season 1, people were asking, so what's up with that choker? Like, what's that for? Is it just a design thing? And I was like, well, I guess we'll find out in season 2. So season 2 became entirely about it. It turned out that the choker was designed to protect Jake from a curse, and he loses it in season 2, and the curse comes into full effect, and it turns into like a 30 to 40 episode thing that goes way beyond the expectation of what was set up, right? So the payoff was probably too much for a lot of readers because by the time of the end of the season, they were like, I had no idea it was going to go this way. And for me, it's really comedic because it's like, now I look back to people asking that question, like, hey, what's up about that choker? And I'm like, and it was a lot of fun. And so, yeah, for me personally, I think it's a great way to set up. I like doing multi-season setups. I think that's fun. I think it's rewarding for people who are into the story. I know it's not rewarding for people who are in and out, but
yeah,
I tend to want to reward my loyal audience versus just the casual audience. Like they'll come and go, of their own accord.
But then at the same time, that's kind of how you build a more loyal audience.
That's how I think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, because when I'm watching something and someone has shown that they've put forethought and effort into their work, I'm a little bit more prone to pay attention to it because it's like if I'm watching something and it's almost like a production value thing. If I'm watching a film and someone has very shit audio and the actor very clearly wasn't prepared and doesn't know his lines that well, that he can't act upon them, that he's just reciting lines that were on the page. To me, that I can tune out and I can go on my laptop or I can start sculpting or drawing or whatever it is that I'm doing and just have it running around as background noise. But if I start noticing that there's craftsmanship put into the storytelling, I'm more likely to pay attention because it's like, oh, they gave a shit. They worked hard on this. And even though I've already paid my $8.50 or whatever it may be, I'm morally obligated to give them my full attention because then I can form a more authentic opinion about their work and I can take more away from it. It's like, oh, this isn't just a cash grab. Someone saw that, elephants fighting at the White House was the big hit thing now in storytelling. So they just shoved elephants at the White House. It's like, no. There's something else going on here. There's an artist with something to say, and they're putting they're putting that effort and the work in, and I feel obligated to pay attention to that. That's how
And that
I
would
feel.
also, yeah, I mean, I think as an example, both you and me have appreciated in the past, Arrested Development is one example of having multi-season setups and payoffs.
Yes.
Within any given episode, there are layers upon layers of setups with layers upon layers of payoffs, and that
Yeah.
was always like really appreciated and enjoyed about the comedy and the story in Arrested Development, because you never really quite, you knew that there were several things that were gonna pay off in some way, but you just like, it was like constantly getting slapped across the face with how everything sort of came one after another. But
Yeah,
yeah,
there's a another show. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I because it started right after we graduated from college and went our different ways. I don't know how familiar you are with the television show Community. It's
oh
now off
yeah,
the air, but it's brilliant. And one of the best setups and payoffs in that freaking show. They make a lot of pop culture references here and there, and throughout like the first two seasons, they said the name Beetlejuice randomly throughout the thing. And in the third season, they were having a Halloween party, and someone said something about the Beetlejuice soundtrack. And in the background, Beetlejuice walked by. And that was a perfect example because if you say the name Beetlejuice three times, he appears. But no one paid attention to that beforehand. And it was one of those things where upon rewatches, I caught it. I never caught it the first time. Like you know what I mean? It was just Halloween background noise to that scene. It was
yeah,
just an extra in costume or whatever. But the fact that they had done that, I don't know if that was planned out. Probably not. I think one of the beautiful things about setups and payoffs is you can always go back after you've completed your work sometimes, or at least completed part of the work, whether it be a draft or an episode or a season, or even just, you're in a sequel in the movie or whatever. And you can look at things that you were in there from someone else, or maybe even from you, that seemingly had no point, and find a way to weave them into a payoff later on, and it makes you look so much better as an artist. Um, Personally, that's kind of how I approach my rewrites. When I'm working on a script, 9 times out of 10, my first draft is absolutely shit. And I know that now. That's why I've come to be a follower of the Church of Rewrites. That is like where I drop to my knees and say my prayers, is the rewriting aspect. And I'll notice once I've started to do a rewrite, I can start connecting dots for things that I didn't know I was going to write the first time. When I start thinking about it, and I'm like, oh, that ties into this. If I just put this here and then I do this and that. And that's where my craftsmanship starts to actually show. And I felt like when I did something like Haunted, I had written that first draft and I had read, people kind of liked it. They kind of didn't. It was a little okay. It got no love from film festivals. None. I'm one of those people that when I get rejected from something like a competition or a film festival, I don't turn my nose up at it and say, fuck you guys, you don't know what you're talking about.
yeah,
I say that now because I know that I've put in the work and I know that the
yeah,
notes that I'm getting back are bullshit. And I'm smarter than the reader who read it. Part of me still, not to get onto a tangent, but part of me will still go, okay, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm just not communicating properly. But when I'm approaching a rewrite, I can start seeing things thematically tying together, and I make those setups and payoffs work. And that's where I feel like that's why I started winning contests. And that's why I started getting momentum. And that's why I had
yeah.
people interested in the story, was because I was showing that craftsmanship and that I was attending to the detail. It's like, if I don't value my audience's time, why are they going to value anything that I'm giving them? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I was just think I started thinking too about it's really important in order for your whole story to pay off, right? You have to
Mm-hmm.
set up the world in which it takes place, right? You have to set up the logic of the world. You have to set up the logic of your characters. You want to do things in a way where a person can look at, let's say, the first 10 to 15 minutes of the story and its establishment and say, all right, I kind of feel like I know this person in real life, or I can kind of know what they're
Yeah.
like. You know what I mean? Or
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I've lived in that place before, or I've seen it. I mean, that's not necessary. the environment is not as necessary as the character, right? The
Right.
character is absolutely necessary, that you have to set them up in a way that a person can relate to them as like either themselves, a family member, a friend, right? So you go, all right, we have what was the name of the Sam Neill's character in Jurassic Park? Is it Doctor or
Dr. Alan Grant.
Thank you. Okay. So not not necessarily everybody can relate to his character, but he's a
Sure.
single 40-something guy who is in a kind of was in a romantic relationship with his fellow paleontologist friend, and he's going to go to a park where some crazy billionaire is going to resurrect dinosaurs. So that last part, there's no connecting, right? That's all of the where do we go from here? But everything before that is setting up, all right, here's this guy. Here's his motivations. Here's his particular like things that annoy him, kids, right?
Yeah.
um, he doesn't like dealing with bureaucratic red tape. He doesn't like having to deal with other people's problems. He wants to go ahead.
Importantly, and very importantly, only because this movie is like my holy grail. This is the movie that made me want
Yeah.
to make movies. He does not get along well with technology.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So that's a big setup for everything else that goes on later on in the movie. So you establish all those things about him, and he's not the only like major character in the movie, obviously, but
Right.
he's one of the he's the one we follow probably the most closely, and he's the one that we really land with at the end of the movie in terms of the themes, the overall themes. And so I'm saying all this because then you have all of the elements that where everything starts to pay off, right? We go into Jurassic Park, crazy shit happens, everything fails
Yep.
magnificently, and the story becomes not only about like surviving dinosaurs, it becomes about growing as a person, because he does take on this journey of where he grows in protecting the lives of these two kids, helping them through Jurassic Park. He suddenly has this parental connection that he never had previously and has a new perspective. So that becomes thematically a payoff to what is set up at the beginning of the movie. And it's really important in a movie that you are in a story, in any story, that your character goes through that kind of arc, so that you can have something for the audience to connect to ultimately at the end of the day. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I feel like when you go into a story, doesn't matter what it is. When you go in,
Yeah.
you want to experience things safely. This is one of the reasons why horror is such a big thing, but safely, so that you can absorb some kind of life lesson out of it. Now, granted, that to me, you should really only be tapping into, if you want to be an effective storyteller, you should be tapping into primal things, primal moralities that I think are almost universal. When you start getting into like social debates about abortion, or how people should get paid minimum
Yeah.
wage and stuff like that, it automatically turns into cringe, because you're either preaching to a choir, or you're trying to preach to somebody who has had some kind of alternative life experiences that disagree with that, and they're just not going to listen to anything you have to say. But if you tap into something that's morally universal, you're much more likely to have your audience latch on, because it's like, okay, here's what the artist is telling me, and now I can interpret that in a way that I can apply to my life. You know what I mean? Like, so Alan Grant goes from someone who didn't want to have kids, and he doesn't understand kids, and he doesn't like kids, to the end, he just kind of realizes, like, this is an opportunity for me to pass on knowledge to these kids, and some fulfillment in his life in protecting them. And he grows in his relationship and his connective relationship with Dr. Ellie Sattler. Like, he gets why she's got those maternal instincts. Like, he grows as a person. So when you watch that movie, it's like, okay, I get it. Like, being a parent is a lot of work. Protecting kids from all the crazy shit that's happening in the world around us. But at the end of the day, it can be very rewarding. And I speak to that now as a father myself. Like I'm operating off of very little sleep these days. And I'll tell you something, before I had my kid, sleep was one of my most prized possessions. And I do miss sleep, don't get me wrong, but every time my kid is in my arms and he smiles at me, man, it changes my world. And I was always one of those guys that never wanted to hold a baby. Like I would go someplace with my wife or whatever, and someone would have a kid, and oh, you want to hold the baby? No, I'm good. I don't want to drop it. I'm afraid I'm going to do this and that. Now I'm in the world where it's like you got to hold the baby. It's your baby. Mom's got to go take a shower. So it's one of those things where you go to a story to grow and tell. So embedding a setup and a payoff, that's telling the story and the growth of that character. That's what really kind of allows the person or the audience member to experience that lesson without having to go through it, because not everybody can afford to have a kid right now, or ever for that matter, or maybe they're just fearful about having a kid. But you can experience that kind of opportunity to grow and gain that wisdom vicariously through the story. But that insertion of unexpected twists and mutations, as you called it, of the payoffs is what makes it lifelike. It's what draws you into the story. So you're not checking your phone, you're not looking at your watch, you're not thinking about other things, what you're gonna have for dinner. It's just about experiencing that thing and living in that world, living in that character. And I think setups and payoffs are a very valuable asset for any storyteller to communicate whatever it is they're trying to communicate in their story.
I have a question real quick, Jow. Can you overcook a setup? Can you set up too much in a story that the payoff isn't even worth it?
Well, I think there's a couple of different faults with some setups. Unless you're going for a comedic aspect or you're really gonna hardcore subvert it, if you make the setup obvious and it's one thing that we've seen before, your audience will tune out because it's like, oh, I've got nothing to get from this. It's something I've absorbed a million times from 1,000 stories already. Why do I need to go through this again? I got it. It's kind of like sitting through basic math class when you're in college and they're like 2 + 2 is 4. I got it. I don't need to go through this again. I mean, I know me and you went to art school, but when we had to go through math class again, I was like, really? We had to pass all these tests to get here. We know this. And audiences are very familiar with the same thing. It's like, oh, I don't want to sit through this again. And then at the same time, another way that setups can become problematic, like you talked about, if you set up too many setups that are not in harmony, I'm using an art school word, harmony with one another. If you're saying too many things, it's like listening to a Kanye West podcast where you're going in so many tangents. It's like, hang on, I'm trying to understand this idea. Let's not go off on this tangent just yet. So I think if you try saying too much, if with too many different setups, it gets to be too many voices talking at once.
That's a really good bit of advice. Do not open more windows than you can close. You're gonna let in all the birds.
Or a tornado for that matter. You know what exactly. Like all that wind coming from different directions is bound to create chaos.
Exactly.
And I think that no one wants to. I mean, granted, there is a time and a place for everything, especially in art. And I think chaos in a story can be a wonderful thing when the culture is craving it, when it's not, when everything has been so wonderfully set up and paid off and explained in so many movies. If you come in and you have a movie that just smashes every expectation and just throws you into the shit, that can be rewarding and that can have value. But at the same time, if you do it too much, it gets confusing. But go ahead.
What I was going to ask, Jow, is, so let's say with a scene, right?
Sure.
Because a scene being part of a story or a movie, a play, whatever, a scene is sort of like a microcosm of the overall story. So it has its own internal setups and payoffs, right? Because that's why you're even having a scene in the first place. Is you're setting up something and you're wanting something at the end of the scene to pay off what it is that you're either setting up in a previous scene or within the self-contained scene itself. What do you have any advice for how many setups are appropriate in a given scene? Does that question make sense? What I'm asking?
Yeah. Well, for one particular scene, you don't want to have too many apples in the air in terms
Yeah.
of what you're juggling. There should be a very simple, maybe I would say 3 tops in terms of what's going.
Okay.
I mean, it's very dependent upon how many characters are in the scene, because more often than not, you want 2 characters with opposing goals in conflict. Now, that's not to say you have, Batman and the Joker in every single scene. You have Batman and Commissioner Gordon in the scene. They're both good guys, but they want They want to get the same thing differently. So having that conflict is very important, even upon allies. So like if you have a setup where Commissioner Gordon knows that there's a rat in his particular department, he's trying to find out who the rat is, and he feels like if he finds out who the rat is, they can catch the Joker. And Batman doesn't care who the rat is. He's more concerned about saving immediate lives right now. We need to save someone because if one person dies, then he'll never get another night's sleep or rest again. So they'll have those conflicting goals. You need to have that set up in a certain way where you know what's going on in the scene. Because I think the most important thing is, and this goes back to the whole chaos and confusion thing, if the audience doesn't understand what the hell's happening, they're getting nothing. They get nothing from the scene. There's no growth from the characters. And more importantly, there's no payoff to either of it because they didn't understand what the setup was to begin with. It needs to be very simple. It needs to be very primally motivated, and it needs to be just, I don't want to say obviously stated, but it needs to be understandable by your audience.
Oh, yeah.
So it's got to be clear. I think a lot of people have problems concisely detailing what a goal is for a character in a particular scene, and the same thing has to apply to a setup. It has to be a very clear setup. If we had talked about this previously about I think is it Pavlov's law about the gun? Is that who it was?
Oh, not Nabokov. I believe I should have freaking actually looked on the internet to confirm, but I think it's called Nabokov's gun. And the idea is that, if you have a loaded gun in a scene, it needs to go off at some point. It doesn't have to go off in that scene, but at some point in the story, it needs to go off. And the reason being is you're pointing out that there's a loaded gun. You're starting to build tension in your audience. So at some point, you need to allow that audience to release that tension, or that unreleased tension is going to go at the artist and go, well, what the fuck? Why didn't you do anything with that? Like, that's a wasted opportunity.
Yeah.
So that's a basic premise, I think. I think that goes with the basic premise of what we were going with earlier, which is you don't want to have too many setups, because if you have a setup that never pays off, great example. I believe this was in The Rise of Skywalker, where Finn is like, Rey, I have something I need to tell you. We never find out what the hell it was that he was supposed to tell Rey. We're just left.
We did because it was paid off in a subsequent comic book or something, or it was some bullshit like that where Disney was trying to get an extra $12 out of your pocket.
So for some handful of people, it paid off, but for the rest of us, it's like a setup that goes nowhere, and so we're just kind of left. What the fuck?
Which can have value itself, because that is how you. There is something that we should discuss when it comes to setups and payoffs, which is open ending, where things are left up to the audience to decide what the payoff particularly was. What would you say is the value of that? Are you a fan of that particular concept where someone presents an idea or something and then leaves it open-ended for an audience? Like, for example, Inception. The top spinning at the very end of the film is a debatable thing where people will debate whether or not the whole thing was a dream or if the top stopped spinning and it was real
That's
life.
that's actually one of the few in my. I mean, as far as I can think of, that's one of the few good examples of a like an open-ended payoff where it's like I'm not sure if he's in or out of the dream. Um, I can't think of too many. Like the only times I've ever really seen that really work for me has been really ambiguous stuff like with Inception, but also like stories that do cover like heavy moral topics where the storyteller's not trying to make you decide on like what what the conclusion should be. It's like, well, what do you think? Like, how do you think that this should end? I don't have direct examples on my mind currently, but I
Yeah.
definitely remember stories where it's like I'm left thinking about all the repercussions of what happened. Twilight Zone stories often go that way, where it's like you're given these big weird things that happen, and you're not really sure what to think about it. It's something that I think can be used very effectively, but you can mess it up too. Like
Yeah.
you can really screw it up.
I would say the reason why something like Inception worked, and this is very important for any storyteller to really understand, is while the plot is cool and it needs to make sense, in the end, it doesn't fucking matter. What really matters is that there is some kind of a closure to a character's journey. Um, there are moments when we watch movies. Like, why do we watch movies again and again, like the same movie over and over? We know where it's going to go. We know how the plot ends, but the value is in the particular journey,
Yeah.
watching those moments unfold, reliving those moments, because that's where the flavor is for
Yeah.
everything. So, like in the case of Inception, Leonardo DiCaprio's character had that arc. He started off like a miserable, separated father, and whether or not he actually made it to his kids, by the end of the movie, he accepted his wife's death. Spoiler
Yeah.
alert. And he was with his kids. At least in his own mind, he was happy, and that was the
Right.
happy ending. Whether was it real or not doesn't really fucking matter, does it? After all, he was happy, and it's the same thing when you look at like the Matrix. Um, did Neo really save everyone? Did he really bust down the
Oh,
Matrix and all
right.
that kind of stuff? You could ask that stuff. Who the fuck knows? I guess we'll find out next year or this year, whenever the new movie comes out and he's actually alive or some shit. I don't know. Um, but I think the big takeaway is that the setups and payoffs are more so about amplifying your character's journey. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? If you can emotionally pay that off, if you can offer closure, resolution, thematic guidance, like in terms of like just
Yeah.
pointing you in a direction of what this was about, the open-ended thing doesn't really matter as much. It's fun to go on an internet forum and make 12
Yeah.
enemies out of people you've never met in your whole entire life because you think it was all dream or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
something,
So
and
I think.
I
Oh, go
think
ahead.
it was probably the reason why he left the top spinning was because I think Christopher Nolan knew deep down in his heart if he went the way of it was all a dream, he would get lynched on the internet because that's been done so much.
Yeah.
And if he was just like, I don't know, you guys figure it out.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it is thematically. It's actually a very perfect way to end that story because it is that is part of the themes of the story, but also in terms of the overall story, like you were saying, I think I just kind of it's there's so much set up in terms of how the logic of all that works, right? Like in so much of the movie, because it's kind of a heist movie in a way, it's like a heist movie in reverse. Um, you the very beginning of it is just setting up how they're going to do the Inception thing, right? So
right,
you're learning about the logic of how this technology works. You're going into people's dreams. There are layers. So for every layer you go, time shifts in a certain direction. I can't remember. I think it's faster the further down you go, and
slower.
it's slower. Okay, it's
Yeah,
slower the further down you go, and so you have all this set up in your head, and the rest of the movie becomes the payoff of you get to see how all that plays out as you see people going 4 layers deep, and they're trying to line up everything exactly so that they can get everybody back out of the, back out of
Yeah.
the dream scenario. And so by the end of that movie, you have gone through all this stuff. It is almost pointless whether or not he is in a dream or not. By that point, it's just like you see the top spinning and you're in a daze from everything else that happened. And so it sort of like almost doesn't matter at that point. And that's why I say like that's one of the few movies where that open-ended sort of payoff, if you will, does work. But I'm gonna
Um,
have to. I want to think of a list of other ones where that works. But go ahead, Joe.
I wanted to get into something with well, not too much into it because we're getting towards the end of the podcast episode. Um, the advantages of doing setups and payoffs for the artist. So, I mean, we've made it very clear that it's very beneficial to an audience member because, you go into a story for surprises and fun and excitement and this and that.
Yeah.
For me, and this is just something that I've kind of cooked up, I like the idea of setups and payoffs as a storytelling technique simply because it allows me to get away with some of the most batshit creative, out there concepts that
Yeah.
my little brain thinks up of when my muse comes knocking. And it's like, hey, you're doing a karate movie. Wouldn't it
Yeah.
be cool if this happened? And my 20 years of martial arts experience goes, no, that doesn't exist. That's not real. That's not how that would happen. But the creative artist part of me is like, yeah, I know, but that's really cool. Like I just want to do this. I want to do this insane thing with this
Yeah.
this concept. And you can almost get away with creative murder of the most obnoxiously batshit things if you set them up properly.
Oh
And
yeah,
I feel
absolutely.
like there's merit for an artist not to scoff at the tried and true technique because I mean it's just as bad as formula. Setups and payoffs are something that is inherent in almost every single story ever found, at least ones that are told with effort.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that instead of just, oh, here's the setup, here's the payoff, I think setups and payoffs are a creative license for storytellers to really run wild with their imagination and not destroy the world that they've created, that they've set it up. You know what I mean? Like the whole
Yes.
big thing of storytelling is, especially in film and theater and stuff like that, is suspension of disbelief. What is your audience willing to accept? And managing their expectations and stuff like that. Like that's the bedrock rule of all storytelling is make sure your audience doesn't go, that would never happen. That's stupid. Like the best and the whenever you find yourself doing that for a movie or something, it's because the artist or the storyteller didn't set it up properly. They did not communicate the elements necessary for you to understand yet not really consciously expect it. Subconsciously maybe you did. um and that's when you can get away with being more imaginative and creative. So I was wondering if you thought if you maybe had any ideas as to why there might be some merit for storytellers to use
Oh,
setups and payoffs
I
outside of
mean,
the obvious mystery, suspense, excitement, but also
yeah.
getting away
So
with
I
shit
was
that's
gonna
crazy.
say, I was definitely gonna say for me, like, going back to the example I said previously for Trailer Park Warlock, where I've set up all these things for myself that I end up utilizing later on. It's extremely useful for me in terms of giving me a trajectory of where my story is going to go, because it's like going forward, I only want to use stuff that is already there,
Yeah.
because there's like a point of no return in a story where if you start setting up new things,
Yeah.
you're going to you're going to weird out your audience because you're like, wait a minute, I thought, what's going to happen? Do you have an
I thought we
example
were
of
wrapping up here. I got shit to do. Yeah. That's a very good note. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up. People should, as storytellers, I should say, when you're telling your story, know there is a point of no return for setups and payoffs.
Yeah.
And I think once you enter the third act or fifth act, whichever kind of structure you're kind of going to, when you start getting into like this, once you get past like the 70% mark of your story,
Yeah.
you should be in full payoff mode. Like
Time to
that's
shut down the shop.
yeah. Like yeah, you could look at it like that. It's almost like running a business for the day. In the morning, you flip the light switch on. When you get towards the night, you flip the light switch off. You take
We're
down the
about to get to
chairs.
2 a.m. You don't have to you don't have to you can't stay here, but you go somewhere. You get the
Well, you
fuck out.
butchered that
I
phrase.
know I did. I know
You
I
don't have
did.
to go, but you can't stay here. um, but speaking of wrapping up and closing up
Yeah.
the thing, I think we should probably do it. We've just hit the 1 hour mark, I think, on this particular episode. So we are going to recap really quick the wonderful bedrock of, or the wonderful points of setups and payoffs. So I'll start us off with the purpose, which is basically to begin managing the expectations of your audience and also to provide them with subtle exposition that's going to be important later, as well as kind of justifying their time and justifying things that happened that you wanted to tell in a story. Mr. Rainwater, if you wanted to cite a couple of the examples that we pointed out that
Yeah,
were
so if you want to see some great examples of on different levels setups and payoffs, I would recommend Jurassic Park has a lot of really great examples. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood has a lot of really good examples. And I didn't even cover any of the other ones in Willy Wonka and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but there's plenty in there. So I highly recommend all those stories. There's always plenty more, but Inception also. All of them work in different levels. They do different. All their setups work in different ways. Sometimes thematic, sometimes for pure mechanics. Inception's very mechanical with its setups and payoffs. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood's very thematic, but it's also very mechanical. It's a mix. Willy Wonka has a lot of thematic ones. So, uh, what do we have next?
Return of Killer Tomatoes. I need to point out
Oh
that movie.
yes,
More
yes.
people need to
Please
be
watch
appreciative
that
of
movie.
that movie. How to apply a setup and payoff is really upon your storytelling as an artist. You could go through your story entirely and then go start inserting or tying together, I should say, your setups and payoffs when you do rewrites or secondary drafts. Or you could look back at previous episodes that you've done and maybe notice mundane things that you included that seemingly maybe you just weren't thinking when you included it, or you just put it in there by accident. Or as Mr. Rainwater said, you could look at the feedback from your audience from things that you've already provided to them that maybe they want to know more about, and you kind of build upon that as a way to kick down creative roadblocks. What's the word I'm looking for here? Not creative roadblocks. What's the word called? Writer's block. Writer's block. Yes. That's a great way to knock down writer's block, is just by looking at things that your audience wants to know about, from that you've quote unquote set up almost instinctively without even knowing it sometimes, that they want to know more about. You can just kind of expel upon that. Audience appreciation, Mr. Rainwater. You want to take that one?
Audience appreciation. In terms of setups and payoffs, you're saying? Like,
what's the merit that they have with the audience?
Oh yeah, I mean it's a great tool for engagement. It's a great tool for keeping people interested in what you're doing. So another example that we had used was Arrested Development is an example for a show that kept my interest throughout the seasons because I wanted to see how things that were set up in previous seasons would pay off later on. It's definitely worked for me as somebody who has done a multi-seasonal story. So I highly recommend it. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to pay off for everybody. For the casual audience, it might not, because they're only going to hang around for as long as they're going to be willing to hang around. But you want to make things like that for people who are in it to win it, because those are the people who are going to appreciate your art the most.
Amen. Subverting expectation, and I'm going to let you jump in a little bit on this, Mr. Rainwater, in terms of our recap, but I think you can only subvert someone's expectation, your audience's expectation, if you've properly set them up to. So by
Oh yeah.
creating we didn't really get into this in the episode, but I'll touch upon it right now. If you set up a rhythm of setups and payoffs throughout your story, then when the audience starts to think that they've figured out your cycle, so to speak, your rhythm, that's when you can jerk the wheel left and go into a different thing. And it feels justified in the eyes of your audience. It's like, oh, they knew I was catching up to them, and now they wanted to smack me across the face and make sure I was still paying attention. Like I didn't feel like I was getting ahead of the storyteller.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to expel upon subverting expectations, Mr. Rainwater, feel free.
Yeah. So like you were saying, you can only do the same you can only do the same thing over and over again so many times. And at a certain point, you want to throw in some monkey wrenches. You want to like make it such that it's not necessarily the same as a twist, right? It's not the same as it's not necessarily the same as like, oh, but you didn't see that one coming. It's just you want to allow the ideas that you're setting up and the ideas that you're getting across to also change and mutate over time. So you want to be able to see, for me personally, I like to do that because I want to see the variations of an idea. So for instance, like I have a character in a story that is a plumber, and the plumber, we're like really going over, but I figure we should hit it.
I feel like we're doing very important work right now because the last time we talked about this, I felt like it was a little bit of a mess, but I think we're really kind of hitting it home. So let's go.
We want to see this person's life from every possible angle. And let's say that over the course of a story, we see this plumber do 3 jobs. The first job goes so-so. He does what he needs to do. He gets paid, goes home. Second job, everything goes to shit. He has messed up everything, and he needs to make up for it in some way. Third job, where would you expect the story would go from here, considering what I've set up? We've had the plumber do the job. Second time the plumber has done the job poorly. So what do you think would happen on the third time?
I'm guessing he would probably learn from his mistake and do the job correctly again.
Now you could do that, right? You could have it, and a lot of people would expect that, and have whatever the thematics of the story would be. Maybe it's a romance story, and like him and the client marry at the end of the thing. But maybe he fucks it up, on the third time, and then they still marry. Suddenly, that's like a different kind of take because you weren't really expecting it to go poorly, and then it also still works out. That's the more left.
You know what that reminds me of? That analogy kind of reminds me, and I'm sure you've seen this. Baby Driver, the Edgar Wright film.
Oh, I haven't seen that movie yet.
Oh, then I won't spoil anything. But
okay.
You do need to check it out because the ending is very much in line with the kind of setups and payoffs that you're talking about. And I don't think that's spoiling anything, but you're going to enjoy that.
What I just described is a couple of episodes that I've done of Trailer Park Warlock where I like to have payoffs where it's like, he actually kind of fucked it up, but it's all right in the end because thematically it works better for that particular story. But so anyway, what do we have? Let's see, what else have we covered? Having too much setup, right? Can you overdo it? Can you overcook it?
Make it focused. You know what I mean? Like say one thing, don't say 1,000 things, and make sure that your audience is understanding what's being said or what's being set up. We didn't get into it, but when we were talking about the gun before, I wanted to come back to this point. Being clear and everything like that. The point that I wanted to make was if you have a gun, you need to at least have a cutaway shot of it in a shot, so that the audience sees that the gun is there, or it needs to be prominently fixated it within the frame of the image of whatever you're looking at. So the audience goes, oh, that's a gun. If a gun is laying flat on a bureau and the bureau's at eye line, I can't tell it's a gun straight
I
on.
see what you're saying.
You know what I mean? Like, you need to clearly illustrate that there is a gun there so that I know that the gun is there.
That's a really, that's a whole, that's a whole thing we didn't quite cover, like how to talk about setting something up, which is like, so in the same example, if you were writing this in prose, right, the person would be observing the gun and then would go into a little bit of depth of description of the gun, where it's laying on the table, wondering why it's there. Like, go ahead, Jow, were you going to say something?
I was going to cite an example of this exact situation in a story that that is readily known to everyone. The very first Pirates of the Caribbean. Johnny Depp's character, Captain Jack Sparrow, has a gun with a single bullet in it. And it was given to him when he was put on the island by himself so that he could shoot himself and put himself out of his misery. And it's brought up in a very passe way where it's like, oh, that's the gun that he was going to use to shoot himself to get himself out of the misery, blah, blah, blah. And that's very easily set up. And it's like, no, he wasn't going to shoot himself. He never wants to fire that gun, da, 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 da. And then the end of the movie, he fires that gun and we find out what he was saving that bullet for. And it's a beautiful payoff. Yeah, it's beautiful. Exactly. We've set it up exactly. It's like, oh, it has a backstory and it has a purpose that we thought we understood. And it really wasn't that purpose. It was for another person's purpose. It was that subversion of the expectation of he's never going to fire that gun because he doesn't want to kill himself. He's not going to ever give in to the other person's demands of, what he should do with his life. And then he ends up using that bullet and that gun for something that he knew all along that we didn't know. And it's a beautiful example of setting up a gun and paying it off later on.
Right. Absolutely. So I think beyond that, the last thing that I can remember we covered was just how is it useful for the artist? Like, how does it make their life? How does it make your life easier? Right.
I think, yeah. And did you want to cover this? Go for it.
No, I mean, I was going to say, no, I was just going to start with mine, I guess, which was that it just makes it easier for me to write because I already have I already have the stuff set up. I just need to follow the trajectory of what's there. That's it for me.
And for me as a writer, I like to think up crazy shit that would never happen, far out there, but it's creatively interesting to me. And when I'm searching for fulfillment as an artist, I like to grab onto things that I feel are interesting and different and, dare I say, original to some extent. But in order to be original, you have to be off the fucking wall, batshit crazy. But in order for your audience to be accepting of it, to be able to suspend their disbelief that it actually could happen in this situation, setups and payoffs are the best way to support your crazy out there ideas that you want to illustrate in your story. And I think that's the most thing. And it also works in a retroactive way in terms of the way that I was talking about being an audience member and appreciating and paying more attention to a work of art when I know that the artist has. So if you do want to grab an audience member like myself, it's good to put those things into your story because that's how you're going to build an audience. And that's what's going to, that's how you sell 2 tickets to the same movie is when someone wants to go back and watch. And everybody likes to fact check movies these days. It's like, oh, I don't know if that was there. I got to go back and look. And then they go back and they look, and that's another $850 in your pocket as an artist. So what's wrong with that? So anyway, that's been the beautiful world of setups and payoffs. I'm glad you guys were here. Next week, we are breaking from the norm. We are subverting expectations. Me and Mr. Rainwater are having a menage a trois here on midnight at the Spaghetti Factory. We are going to have one of our good friends joining us. He's an interesting cat, and I'm so excited to catch up with him.
Yeah, this is going to be awesome.
I promise it's not going to be 3 college schlubs just talking about the good old days. We will be getting into some art stuff. So please tune in next week. I think it's going to be a good show. He's definitely a character. We don't have to get into his name, but he's definitely a character in his own right. And
Yeah.
I don't want to say he clashes with me and Mr. Rainwater, but he's definitely a breath of fresh air compared to
He's an
us.
excellent compliment to.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're going to want to tune in for that because I think there's going to be some interesting points of view, maybe even, dare I say, debates on our first thing. Because me and Mr. Rainwater are seemingly on the same page about a lot of things, but this wonderful artist that will be joining us can very easily go against the norms and be completely just as much right as we are. And
Yeah.
it's very interesting to see the contrast that can occur. I'm not saying we butt heads on everything because I don't think we do, but there's definitely bound to be a little bit of disagreement. So if you're coming for some fight, there might be a little bit of fight in a good way, like an exhibition fight, I guess you could say. Either way, I'm jazzed about it. I hope you guys will be too after this little promo that I'm cutting right now. But it's going to be a doozy. It's definitely going to be a good time. Rainwater, do you have anything to add about setups and payoffs before we wrap this?
Do them. That's all I. If you're writing a story, don't just write a bunch of exposition about your world. Like, actually have it mean something to the overall story. Have it actually pay off in some way. Let something change in the story that meaningfully uses all the stuff that you're setting up, and don't just write a world into being just for the sake of writing a world into being.
Absolutely.
How about you, Jow?
I'm just gonna ditto what you said. I think we've talked too much, so I've talked too much. So let's wrap this baby up, and we will see you guys next time. Take it easy.
Talk to y'all later.